Okay, I think we'll probably just start, and I'll just admit anyone obviously that joins in the next few minutes. Good morning and welcome everyone. What we'll do, so we've got our two speakers, Neil and Kevin. They're gonna do their bits first, and then there'll be a time for questions afterwards and for any sort of discussions. If you guys don't mind just doing a quick introduction, just so we know who's here. I'm just going to go, so I'll let the speakers introduce themselves when they start, but I will start with Annabelle, if you could just say who you are and where you're from.
Sorry, bear with me a moment. I'm trying to work out how to unmute. It's been ages since I've used Zoom. And this is really embarrassing as well. My name's Katie, but my daughter is Annabelle, who's been using my phone. So I've since changed the name. So
I didn't think I didn't have any Annabelles booked in, but I just went with it. But okay, no worries.
Sorry. So my name's Katie. I work with Southampton City Council. I'm the Allocations and Advice Manager. I'm very new to this role. I've been doing it for about 2.5 weeks only, but I've been with the department for 9 years. So yeah, that's me. Bye.
Thank you. And next on my screen, Helen.
Hi, once again, apologies for the lack of camera. I'm Helen Greenway. I work for Herefordshire Council. I'm the Housing Strategy Officer. I think I can beat you, Katie, as a newbie because, I know you've been there for 9 years, but I've literally rejoined the council a week and a half ago. So I'm very new back to the council way of working as well as within the post. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. I've got Ashley.
Yeah, sorry, just to mute myself. I'm in the office, so if I look like I'm doing things at the same time, I apologise. So I'm Ashley Brightmore. I'm the senior for the Housing Options team at King Russell Borough Council over Housing Register, Homelessness and Allocations.
Thank you. And it's Keisha?
Hi, morning. Keisha,
yeah.
Hi, Keisha Tate. I'm the rehousing manager at Southwark Council, responsible for the Part 6 housing register allocations and accessing widening participation for housing choice.
Brilliant, thank you. Sarah.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Pearson. I'm working with Redbridge at the moment. I'm in their digital team, so I'm doing some work with the housing needs team and just trying to review the whole system and the whole service, but looking at it from a digital perspective as well. So I'm a consultant, but I've been brought in just to work with Redbridge for the next 12 months, I think. So yeah, I'm doing a lot of work with the rehousing, the housing needs. We're doing quite a bit with rough sleepers at the minute, so I'm really interested in what's happening today.
Brilliant, thank you. Ellen?
Yep, hi, Ellen Black. I'm the Allocation Manager for Ashford Borough Council. I have responsibility for the housing register and also for temporary accommodation, but that's the new part of my role. I've been in allocations for lots longer. Yep, that's me.
Brilliant, thank you. Wendy?
Hiya, I am currently the Policy and Strategy Manager at Kensington and Chelsea. Been doing that for about a year now. And previously I was the Options, Allocations and Reviews Manager.
Brilliant, thank you. Susanna?
Hi everybody, I'm Susanna Young, Policy Officer at the National Housing Federation. We represent housing associations, but our members are also obviously very keen to work with local authorities, and they do as part of their kind of daily work. We're doing a big piece of work on allocations, kind of how best to ensure that social housing is allocated efficiently, fairly, and looking at kind of how to match housing need with kind of the appropriate properties. We've just done a big piece of research as well with our members on rehousing homeless families. So I'm really pleased to be here to kind of hear how things are working with local authorities, and if I can contribute in any way, I will also do so, if that's helpful.
Thank you. Patrick?
Thank you, Vanessa. My name is Patrick Lee. I work for Portsmouth City Council as lead business manager, and my interest in this is I'm doing a piece of work at the moment for our allocations and temporary accommodation and homelessness team, and it's to look at the flow through from demand to our end-to-end times and trying to improve those and improve the offer for people presenting as homeless to the council. I'm particularly interested in what Susanna's just been talking about as well around the relationship and the partnerships with housing associations. So I'm going to be looking at that as well. So I'm very interested in what we're going to talk about this morning. Thank you.
Brilliant. Ricky?
Hi all, I'm Ricky Bellot. I'm the Housing Choice and Supply Manager at Southwark Council. We're in the process of reviewing our housing allocation scheme, something which is we're putting a lot of work into at the moment. It's actually a long-standing item and very contentious within our borough in order to try and get things right. But we really want to explore how we can do more with our declining number of allocations that we've got each year, and how best we can match that up to our housing needs categories. So yeah, that's why I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. Mariana?
Sorry, I'm new on a Zoom, I'm struggling. My name is Mariana. I'm managing allocations and voids service for Hammersmith and Fulham Council. I've joined the group today as I would like to know, like, what are the current trends. Hammersmith and Fulham is currently migrated from something called assisted choice allocations to well-known choice-based letting. So we are creating some sort of hybrid system, keeping a closed door policy, but then opening kind of a portal for people to bid for the properties they want to. So yeah.
Thank you. And I think that's everyone that I can see. Is there anyone that I've missed out? I don't think there is. If so, yeah, no, there isn't. Brilliant. Well, I'll hand it over to Neil. You're going first, aren't you?
Yep, super. Thank you very much, Vanessa.
Thanks.
Thanks all of you for introducing yourself so well. You'll hear from my counterpart, Kevin, in due course. But I'm going to talk you through some policy-based stuff initially, and the sort of the wider national picture. I'm just sorting out sharing my screen so that you can all hopefully see what we're talking about a bit better. So in a minute, I'll get the slideshow going. There we go. So here we are, today's briefing. Hopefully you've had your breakfast already, because being it in this digital platform way, we can't give you any breakfast. Now, the first image here is St Martin's Cottages, and they are that is the first social housing built in Europe. It was built in 1869. Oh, sorry about that. Built in 1869, and it was built by the City Corporation of Liverpool in response to a massive public health crisis that was occurring in the city. Liverpool was having huge numbers of people that were ill for all kinds of reasons, including due to insanitary conditions within the city, as well as population expansion. And the City Corporation at the time sought to approach a number of private developers to say, can you build some more affordable housing that people on lower incomes, people close to poverty or in poverty can rent at a more affordable rate and have somewhere decent to live. And those they got no response from the private developers. So the City Corporation decided to build the housing itself, and consequently became the first public housing or social housing in Europe. The St Martin's Cottages perhaps don't look like the image of a cottage you might imagine, some sort of cozy thing in the countryside. It looks very municipal and very urban, but it's a nice, quaint name for it. One of the challenges they had with St Martin's Cottages, these existed from 1869 until 1977, when they were pulled down and replaced with more modern social rented housing. But one of the challenges that occurred once St Martin's Cottages were built was that the City Corporation had intended for them to be let to the most poor in the city. There was a very clear understanding that housing was causing ill health, and ill health was causing all kinds of other consequential problems. So decent housing would promote good health. And so this house should go to the poorest, except when the City Corporation took a look around the finished building, they found it was of a better quality than what they might imagined. And so there began some debate as to how best to allocate these homes. And who should be prioritised for the allocation of these homes, with some saying, well, it should go to the poorest because that was our intention, and others saying, actually, it's probably too good for the very poorest, and it should go to artisans. They're sort of a rung above the poorest. They might not be wealthy, but they're probably slightly more deserving. So the debate around who should get allocated social housing and what the fairest way to do it has been there since the very beginning, with people disagreeing about how best to prioritise people for an allocation. And really, the debate continues right up until today. You'll see here housing waiting lists from down the years. This information is kept by UK government, by Department for Levelling Up, or whatever it's calling itself at this current time. And you can see this time series goes back to 1987 all the way to 2021. And you can see that levels peaked in round about 2012 to just above 1.8 million. And levels were at their lowest round about 1996, 1997, when they fell to just around 1 million. Currently, 2021, which is the most recent data we've got, levels are around 1.2 million people waiting for housing. And the big changes here occur really around 2001, 2002, the first one, when numbers begin to rise quite considerably. And this coincides with the introduction of choice-based lettings and a real change in the way we allocate social housing. And it also coincided with a change in demand for social rented housing, where previously supply of social housing for several years had exceeded demand in many areas, particularly post-industrial areas. And the need to have an allocations policy, or to even strictly adhere to allocation policy, wasn't so concerning, because you were just grateful for someone to come along and show an interest in renting your council housing. Subsequently, with the changes in the housing market and with the introduction of choice-based lettings, social housing became a much more demand, and numbers of people registering for social housing substantially increased. We then see a significant drop in 2012, and that follows the introduction of the Localism Act, which gave local authorities the ability to make decisions about who did and didn't qualify for an allocation of social rented housing in their area. And there's been a substantial drop ever since the introduction of that legislation, and that's never really picked up again by any significant way. Numbers have leveled out and perhaps are slightly increasing since in the past 3 or 4 years, but there's no real massive upswing like there has been previously. So do we know demand's there, and demand roughly floats around sort of 1.2 million, 1.4 million, so somewhere around that over the last 30 or so years. The regulator publishes a whole bunch of statistics around social housing lettings taken from local authorities and housing associations. The most recent data is up to the end of March 2020. They've not published anything more recent since then. But that most recent data shows that around about 325,000 households were allocated social rented housing in that year, which was approximately a quarter of all people on the waiting list. So 1 in 4 people got an allocation on waiting lists. 3/4 of people on housing waiting lists were still on there at the end of the year, still waiting for a home. You can see that 2/3 of allocations were made by housing associations, 1/3 by local authorities, which roughly reflects the ownership of stock between those two sectors of the social housing market. By far and away, most people were let social housing on a social rent setting. and the minority of people were let social housing on an affordable rent setting. Again, 3/4 of social housing let during that year were people with a general need for social housing, with only 1/4 being let to those who had a supported housing need. But I think it's still important to recognise that 1 in 4 people that are being allocated social rented housing are being allocated supported housing, and the valuable role that social housing provides to helping people live independently in the community. Who's getting social housing? Well, it's primarily single people, with over 50% of allocations being made to single adults, and a further 1/5 of allocations going to single adults with 1 or more children. So it gives us a real indication of who's living in our stock in terms of household composition. And we know there's a lot of tension between demand for single person accommodation versus the availability of single person accommodation in the housing market generally, and in particular in the social rented sector. And so this gives a really indication on the pinch point here. Waiting times, generally around about 50 to 60% of people are waiting under a year to get a property, with only around about 15% of people waiting for more than 5 years. So that's perhaps better than what you might imagine. Obviously, these are national waiting times, and in some areas of the south, particularly London and the southeast, waiting times will be higher, and some areas, particularly in the northeast and parts of the northwest, waiting times will be lower. But that's the national picture. On average, more people are getting allocated under a year than having to wait for 5 or more years. We know a whole bunch of other stuff around people that are being allocated social housing that informs who's in our properties, but also informs what our allocation schemes should look like, and how we might want to tailor them, and the types of rules we might want to include in our allocation schemes. So we know that just almost 1/3 of people being allocated social rented housing are in employment. We know that 85% of people get a long-term tenancy at the point they're allocated social rented housing. So short-term, fixed-term tenancies are not used to any great degree. We know that 8%, just over 8% of social rented housing is allocated to a person of a white ethnic origin. Conversely, if you flip that round, it means that persons of a Black or other minority ethnic origin are equating to 18% of all new allocations. That's greater than the national profile, where households of a Black or minority ethnic origin equate to around about 12% of the whole population. So it gives you, again, an indication of the characteristics of who we're allocating social housing, and gives us some thought as to how we provide our allocation services. Almost 20% of allocations are going to statutory homeless households. 14% of allocations are going to households who were previously living in the private rented sector. And you might have seen in the news today and yesterday around the government's intentions to take forward legislation to bring an end to no-fault evictions, to strike out Section 21 notices. So that might change some of that dynamic in due course, but at the moment there's a steady supply of people, steady number of people coming from the private rented sector into the social rented sector. People that were allocated social housing on a social rent rate were paying on average £82 per week, which equates to 46% of market rents. The small number of people that were allocated, around about 14% of people that were allocated social rented housing on an affordable rent rate were paying on average £128 per week, which equates to around 66% of the market. And you'll know, of course, affordable rents can go up to 80%, but taking the national picture into account, they're sitting at 66% at this current time. Overall, we know that general needs social rented housing, new lettings are more likely to be allocated to people who are younger, female, and of a Black or minority ethnic origin compared to the overall population. All of these facts are key, and you should understand these things in your local area. I'm sure you do, but all these are key to informing how we shape our allocation policies, who we might prioritise and how we might prioritise them, whether we use any special additional prioritisation for people in work, how we determine what our qualification criteria might be. All of these are really key for that. We've got a whole bunch of legislation that drives our allocations work. There's two principal pieces of legislation, the Housing Act 1985 and the Housing Act 1996. Local authorities, of course, will find all of their allocations legislation here in the 96 Act. Housing associations still need to be looking at the 1985 Act. There's key pieces of legislation still from the 85 Act that stand and are very relevant for housing associations. And it's important to remember that housing associations allocations are subject to public law and therefore can be taken to judicial review, just like local authorities. There's a significant number of statutory guidance. There seems to be a new piece of statutory guidance every couple of years, which seems almost like a part work series that you build up over time. 5 pieces of codes of guidance if you're an allocations officer, with the oldest dating back to 2012 and the most recent being published in 2020, but various pieces of existing statutory guidance have had updates. All of this guidance is intended for local authorities only. There's no statutory guidance for housing associations at all, even though they're subject to some of the same statute as local authorities. What housing associations do have to have regard to is the tenancy standard published by the regulator of social housing. That tenancy standard shows a number of outcomes that the regulator expects social landlords, registered providers to deliver against. But again, there's no guidance or good practice that explains what good looks like against the tenancy standard. So registered providers are really reliant on just working to their own principles in that respect. There's a whole bunch of extra legislation that doesn't really appear on that previous slide as well. So, for example, the Regeneration Act 2008 defines what social housing is. There is a legal definition of social housing, and it's really important we understand that legal definition, because we can't allocate outside that legal definition. None of the statutory guidance makes any reference to the fact that there's a legal definition of social housing. The Regeneration Act 2008 makes it very clear that social rented housing is for homes for rent or sale or shared ownership for people whose needs cannot be met by the commercial housing market. So straight away, it gives us some very clear boundaries as to who can and who cannot get social rented housing. The law makes it clear that those whose needs can be met by the commercial housing market, those who are earning enough or have saved enough, already own homes, they shouldn't be getting an allocation of social rented housing. So it's really important to have regard to that. And there are other pieces of legislation that drive our allocations work, such as the Children Act 2004, where we must make sure that when we're making an allocation, we have a regard to the needs of any children in the household in terms of how we make our allocation decision. There's immigration legislation that drives eligibility conditions, and for housing associations makes them carry out right to rent checks. There's Equality Act 2010, of course, which makes sure that for every allocation decision we make, we're taking in regard of people's characteristics. And of course, there's data protection legislation that makes sure that when we share information about any applicant, whether it be to a housing association we might be nominating them to, or other organisations that we might want to consult with when we're making decisions, all of that data protection legislation has to be followed. So that's the headline legislation, but there's a whole bunch of other legislation that sits behind all of this on this slide here. Policy on social rent housing at a national level, it doesn't come out as frequently and as fully perhaps as what we might see for our counterparts around homelessness. There's a lot of policy that comes out around homelessness, or quite consistently from national government. There's less that comes out around social housing allocations. The Social Housing Green Paper from a few years ago now instigated an evidence collection. Government decided to look at how social housing is being allocated, what were the models that were operating across the country, what was working well, what were people feeling didn't work so well. So the UK government instigated a huge evidence collection session and assessed those results, and have pledged to publish the results of that evidence collecting exercise. Those results are yet to be published. But obviously they would be beneficial to everyone in terms of understanding what the national picture is around social housing allocations and what the government determined to be working well and what could be working differently. We've got some idea of what that evidence collection has revealed, because the social housing white paper that came out in 2020 set out some headlines for us to take a look at. And although that social housing white paper is overwhelmingly 99% of it is about how regulation of social housing is going to change and be more tenant focused, and indeed, again, that's going to be subject to a bill in this Parliament. There is three paragraphs that are dedicated to housing allocations, that if you're interested in your job as housing allocations, you really need to understand and be all over. And it's going to be what I'm focusing on the rest of my presentation, really. The government, from its evidence collecting over the previous years, have revealed 4 themes that they want to focus on. The first of which is improving joint working between local authorities and housing associations. The second is around removing barriers to access to social housing for homeless households. The third theme is around ensuring vulnerable households are able to navigate local authority allocation systems. And then the fourth theme is around improving access to suitable homes for disabled people. The government have promised and set out in the social housing white paper that they're going to publish guidance on all of these matters. The social housing white paper doesn't say when that guidance will be published, and it doesn't say whether that guidance will be statutory guidance or good practice guidance. So we'll have to just wait and see what happens with all of this. But while we're waiting for their guidance and for further and for the results from their evidence collection exercise to be published, there's still stuff we can be busy doing and getting on with. And I've been working with local authorities, me and my team have been working with local authorities on all 4 of these themes over the past few years to try and take some of these matters forward. And this is what we're going to be focusing on now. So in terms of joint working between local authorities and housing associations, for allocations law, there's a very particular piece of legislation that we can have reference to and as a foundation for our thinking. And that's section 170 of the Housing Act 1996, part 6, where there's a duty on housing associations to cooperate with local authorities around the allocation of social rented housing. The duty doesn't really go beyond anything. The duty doesn't describe it much more than that. There's no indication of how that duty must be fulfilled, just simply that there is a duty for housing associations to reasonably cooperate with local authorities' housing allocation schemes. So we have to, as a sector, work out what that looks like and what that means, because there's no real case law on this either. Supplemented against that duty is from the tenancy standard published by the regulator of social housing. There's a regulatory requirement on housing associations to cooperate with local authorities' strategic housing functions and their duties to meet identified housing needs. So this reinforces that legal duty. The regulatory requirement reinforces that legal duty. In the real world, these are manifested in a couple of key ways. One of which is the use of common housing registers and common housing allocation policies. If you've got a common register where you're all using a shared database and people are filling out only one application form in your local authority area, then straight away there's evidence there that there's cooperation between housing associations and local authorities. If that common arrangement extends beyond the registration process and goes to as far as actually having a common policy where there's one set of rules that determine who qualifies, who's prioritised, etc., then that's even more evidence that there's cooperation going on. And of course, it's we know from all of our work, people seeking social housing very much like common registers and common policies. They prefer them. People want a single way of applying for housing in their area. Very much, again, I guess, like transport systems. And Greater London has had a single ticketing system for transport for many, many years. And outside of London, everybody suffers from having to use multiple different tickets for multiple different forms of transport. And people don't like that. And it's the same very much with social housing. They want one form to fill in and one set of rules to follow to understand how they're going to get social housing in their local area. Another way to demonstrate joint working between local authorities and housing associations is, of course, nomination agreements. Those housing associations that have been formed as a result of large-scale voluntary transfers from local authorities are legally required to have a nomination agreement with their local authority. That legal requirement will be set out in the transfer deed, as will the nomination rate. Housing associations that were not created as a result of a large-scale voluntary transfer are not legally required to have a nomination arrangement, but good practice suggests that they should still enter into some sort of nominations arrangement, as it's the best way, or one of the best ways, to demonstrate they're fulfilling the section 170 duty to cooperate. There's very, very old good practice advice from the National Housing Federation and the local government association on how to make nomination arrangements work. Again, there's very little case law on nominations. There's very little in the statutory guidance around nominations, but there is some old good practice guidance from around about 2004 around nominations that really unpicks how to deal with the challenges around nominations that housing associations, local authorities can sometimes stumble over, and particularly how to deal with conflicts where one party believes the nomination should stand and another party believes it shouldn't. So there is some stuff out there, and there's probably a need to have some more up-to-date advice on this. Information sharing protocols, again, given the data protection legislation that both housing associations and local authorities have to oblige to around allocations. And for the purpose of housing allocations, local housing associations are treated as a public body, and local authorities definitely are a public body generally. So it's really key that you have information sharing protocols that satisfy the data protection legislation and that they're kept up to date, and that staff are following them. And again, it's another way of demonstrating that there's that duty to cooperate is being fulfilled and that there is effective joint working. In terms of accessing social housing for homeless households, there's a separate duty to cooperate here. The section 213 duty to cooperate falls under part 7. This is a different duty to cooperate that we see under part 6. This duty to cooperate is a duty to cooperate with homelessness assistance. Again, the law doesn't define exactly what that might look like. It's for local authorities and housing associations to determine. Again, there's no real case law on this, but this typically might be a local authority approaching a housing association to say, can we use some of your stock to fulfill temporary accommodation duties, please? So from local authorities and housing associations points of views, when they're working together with homeless households, it's really important to understand what duty they're trying to exercise around this cooperation. Are they trying to work within the framework of part 6, the duty to cooperate around allocations, or is this joint working with a homeless household around part 7, the duty to cooperate around home assistance? And in many cases, it could be actually the housing association, local authority want to cooperate under both duties, but it's key to understand which duty you're working under. The National Housing Federation has published a commitment to refer. This mirrors the statutory duty to refer with section 213B duty to refer, which lists 7 different public bodies that have a legal duty to refer. Your homeless colleagues will know this duty to refer well, and some of you may well work around homelessness services as well, so you might know it. The housing associations don't have a legal duty to refer people who they believe to be at risk of homelessness, but the National Housing Federation has introduced a voluntary standard here. Their website provides lots of details around what the commitment to refer looks like and lists all the housing associations that have signed up to the commitment to refer. It's a good exercise to look at which housing associations in your areas have signed up to the commitment to refer, and approach those housing associations that haven't and ask them to get involved. Likewise, Homes for Cathy is a housing association sector-led initiative. There's 9 standards that Homes for Cathy have created that are asking housing associations to deliver against around tackling homelessness. Again, the Homes for Cathy website lists all of those housing associations that have signed up to this voluntary standard. And again, it's a good exercise to check which housing associations in your area have signed up to the Homes for Cathy initiative, and to support them in working towards achieving all of those standards, delivers outcomes for the local authority and for the housing associations, as well as, of course, for people who are homeless. One of the main ways I think we can change and influence how social housing how homeless households access social housing is by use of our powers, our legislative powers. In law, we've got power, local authorities have got power to determine who qualifies. Local authorities have got power to determine the degree of choice applicants are entitled to. Local authorities have got powers to award some applicants additional preference, and local authorities have got powers to decide how people are prioritised for an allocation. And so careful consideration of all of these powers and how we're framing our schemes for homeless households. One way of framing them can actually potentially limit or prohibit their access to social housing, whereas another way of framing one or more of these powers can enhance people's ability to access social housing. So there's a real opportunity to explore how to use these powers for their fullest effect. So homeless households aren't consciously or unconsciously disadvantaged and are more better enabled to access social housing. Finally, there's the concept of furnished tenancies. It's not something that many social landlords do, but we've seen that some housing associations have taken this approach, and it's been transformative in terms of the ability to let properties in the first place, and importantly, to help homeless households sustain their tenancy. So Furnished Tenancies is another way that we can enhance the way we help people to access social housing when they're homeless. Vulnerable households, then, is the third theme that the social housing white paper looks at. Vulnerable households navigating housing allocation systems. The government wants to improve how that happens. A lot of the practice here is it could also be used for homeless households, where we just talked about before. But one of the first things you might want to do is, within the scope of your allocation policy, is define what you mean by vulnerable households. And there's plenty within allocations legislation, homelessness legislation, housing law generally, that you can use to inform a definition of what you mean by vulnerable within your own local policy. And there's some general assumptions that I think we could all agree on as to who would be more likely to be vulnerable and who might be less likely to be vulnerable. When you come up with what your definition of vulnerable is for your policy, thinking about how you work with those households that you've termed to be vulnerable. So making sure that information and assistance is readily available for vulnerable households. There's a legal requirement for all applicants to be given information on allocation of social housing in any given local authority area. And that information has to be relevant to the individuals that need it. There's also a legal requirement to provide assistance. So that assistance could vary depending on the individual, but we need to make sure that information and assistance is very prominent within our service offer. With the move to choice-based lettings, there's been a big move to online with people expecting to bid, people expecting to self-serve, and there's a lot of value in all of that, and all of that should be absolutely retained and be built upon and made as efficient and as streamlined as possible. And Kevin, who's going to speak after me, can talk much better about that than me, but that shouldn't be sacrificed at the expense of frontline staff having a human transaction with people that might be considering applying for housing, or might be in the act of applying, or waiting for an offer, or considering an offer, and helping them to make informed decisions in their best interest. Research we've been doing recently with housing associations around tenant satisfaction shows that tenants really want and enjoy speaking to staff, and they like that transaction with staff, and they prefer speaking over the phone, and they're content to use self-serve applications, but they prefer to actually speak to a member of staff. So, and this really sort of reinforces that first bullet point. What we can do around vulnerable households is make sure that our application is really good at gathering evidence of vulnerability, making sure that then when we make a decision as to whether someone is eligible and or qualifies to join the scheme, that we thoroughly assess that evidence around vulnerability, and we get independent authoritative opinions around the evidence that's being presented to us by applicants, and that we keep that evidence of vulnerabilities updated all the way through the time someone is involved in the allocation scheme, up to the offer stage, so that when we're making the offer, our evidence around someone's vulnerabilities remains relevant and isn't this out-of-date evidence that we collected some years ago that we've never revisited. Likewise, for vulnerable households, it's really important that any organisations that are involved in supporting that household is involved at the application stage, at the decision stage, at the offer stage, invited to come along to the viewing, invited to come along to follow-up visits, so that support that the vulnerable household needs that will help them sustain their tenancy is there from the outset, and that partnership between the landlord and the tenant and the other support agencies are going from the very beginning. And again, making sure that at the letting stage, we ensure that support is locked in and continues as the tenancy begins. And crucially, doing joint risk assessments and support assessments so that we understand from a housing provider's point of view what we're going to need to do differently or better or extra, but what support providers involved with this individual might need to do differently or better or extra. And so all of these points could apply to any vulnerable households. And of course, vulnerable households might include those that are homeless or at risk of homelessness. Improving access for disabled people. When we're talking about disabled people, we have to remember that people with a disability will have either a physical disability or a sensory disability, or sometimes perhaps both. Again, the information we talked about on the previous slide around helping vulnerable households, all that information could equally apply to disabled people, but there's some additional stuff here for us to consider. Making sure that, again, considering that people might have a physical or a sensory disability, how relevant is the information that we provide to people about the attributes of a property and local neighbourhood facilities, and how good quality is that information, and is that information in a user-friendly, provided in a user-friendly way, and does it highlight the features and aspects that people with a disability would need to know about. Making sure that, again, there's information and support offered to people with a disability all the way through the process, making sure, again, that information and assistance is very prominently available and people feel that it's very easy to access that information and support in a way that's relevant to them. Making use of accessible housing registers, so keeping a list of every property that's already adapted for people with physical disabilities, so that we can prioritise the reallocation of those homes to people on our waiting list that are waiting for an adapted property. These properties will have been benefited from the use of disabled facility grants. They'll have had sometimes quite significant adaptation and equipment put in. Let's make best use of that equipment and that funding, rather than stripping it all out and reallocating it to someone that might not benefit from it. Instead, let's prioritise it for people that will benefit from it. Let's think about the format of housing options information. Is it available in Braille? Is it available in audio, or any other format that a person with a disability might need it to be provided in? And is it obvious that people can get housing options information and information about the allocation scheme in alternative formats? Again, let's think about our housing needs assessments from at the very outset of an application process. How user-friendly is that assessment? How relevant is that assessment? How well trained have staff been around understanding disabilities and how to talk to people about their disabilities, and to record and catalogue that evidence of housing need in relation to someone's disability? And how well are we using that evidence to inform future housing developments and passing it to our colleagues in other parts of the council that might be developing local development plans and what have you? And then finally, how good are we at marketing new homes that are wheelchair accessible? Do we do as well as we can to promote this new supply of housing? And most homes now are built to lifetime standards. So are we, again, cataloguing them effectively? Are we including them on our disabled access register where we've got one? Are we making the most of this provision? The government's ambition around all of these four themes, around joint work between housing associations, around making things more accessible for homeless households, around improving how we help vulnerable households within housing allocation schemes, and improving how we help people with disabilities. All of this is about, the headline for the government is making sure that social housing is allocated fairly. And really, there's a number of things that encapsulate all of this: accessible and relevant information, proactive and thorough assistance, intuitive and logical application, a comprehensive and robust policy, consistent and quality decision-making, transparent and rigorous appeals process, regular and open communication, and knowledgeable and skilled employees. And I guess if I had to pick two out of that list, really it's about how good your policy is and how good your people are. If you've got the right policy and the right people, you'll be able to deliver effectively with your housing association colleagues and help people who are homeless or vulnerable, have a disability, to ensure that the social housing is allocated fairly. But without the right policy and without the right people, those things are going to be much harder to accomplish. What's going to be key to underpinning all of these things is, of course, the IT system that drives all your work and hopefully makes things more streamlined and more user-friendly for everybody, staff and applicants alike. And my counterpart, Kevin, is going to talk to you about that very thing. So I will hand over to Kevin, and he was going to talk about how IT can contribute to this. I know there's a number of questions in the chat. Some might be for me, some might be for others, but we will take some questions after Kevin has finished his presentation.
Thank you, Neil. Good morning, everybody. Let me just share. Hopefully, can everybody see a presentation?
Yeah.
Yep, great. So let me just do that. Great. Good morning. My name is Kevin Millard. I am the product manager for a company called Hume. You may or may not have heard of us before. We were formed 3 years ago. We have many years of housing needs solutions. So we specialize in IT systems for housing needs. And when we say housing needs, we look at housing register applications, homelessness, temporary accommodation, choice-based lettings. So all of that side of the process. And we created the company to do something a little bit different. Having worked for previous housing needs suppliers, there was always room to do things slightly differently. A lot of people now are looking for different things out of their system, and there's a drive to do things slightly differently. And some of the common issues that we've seen over a number of years tends to be linked to legacy IT systems that don't adapt or don't change very well. It seems to be one area that quite often a system will be put in, it will sit there for many years, do its job, but it never evolves with how your policies evolve, how you want to allocate things, how your business practices evolve. So you end up with these common issues that quite often the IT system's blamed for, and it's not always the IT system's fault. It's because it's never been updated or changed. So systems becoming out of sync with policies is a really common thing. People change their policy, but they never get around to changing their system. A number of reasons for this. One, it can be too expensive. Two, it can take too long. By the time you've got it changed, maybe you're then looking to change something else again. You'll have new schemes that may be developed, be built, that suddenly introduce new allocation rules. So you're trying to fudge the system to work to these rules. You end up, if you don't fudge the system, with the wrong applicants on the shortlist. Regardless of if you're generating your shortlist in the back office or you're doing CBL, if you've got the wrong applicants on the shortlist, it's not efficient. It's meaning that you're having to do more work, more workarounds. If you do get the right applicants on the shortlist, are they in the right position? Does your system account for new priorities that you want to give? Now, this might be as an overall as an allocation scheme change, or it could be down to particular developments. Can you give priority to people with local connection? Can you give priority to certain properties? If you're doing a quota system, you may suddenly want to change the order which you want to prioritize people. So it's quite often that we see, people say, oh, our system doesn't work because our shortlists are rubbish. We have the wrong people in the wrong places. So what happens is people export shortlists into spreadsheets and they start playing with them and trying to order them correctly outside of the system. One of the big issues you have there is your audit trail is then completely gone. You've got no way of actually managing and understanding how they're being allocated. Is it being done in accordance to your policy? Are all the processes being followed? So it's one of those things that it's the perfect thing that IT systems can help with. They are great at capturing data and enforcing rules. So they just do, an IT system will just do what it's told. And there's two big parts that when it comes to allocations that sort of fit into this, which is your housing register applications and the eligibility and shortlisting. They are all very much rule-based processes. And you're probably doing both of these at the moment, but do they actually fit in with what you want to do? So there's been a big change in systems, probably the last 5 years, where you've got systems that you can actually do more with yourself. all of the big IT suppliers are moving this way. They're trying to move away from these legacy applications that are expensive to maintain, expensive to update. Everybody's moving towards cloud-based or SaaS solutions. And you want to have more control over your IT systems. It gives you the ability to change things. And I suppose that's one of the things that when we set Hume up, was one of the things was we look to allow you to configure as much as possible. So as things change, you've got the ability to be able to adjust the system yourself. You will never get things like your application form right first time. Because if you try to aim for perfection on an application form, you will spend weeks, if not months, constantly refining it. Whereas if you can actually get it 95% there, but then amend it as you go forward, then it means that you can actually adjust and adapt as you need to. So I've just put a couple of slides together just to look at a couple of these sort of two areas and to try and highlight what you should be looking for when it comes to IT systems to support your application process. Neil mentioned a number of bits around data and about how a lot of data is used to track where the allocations are going. And it highlights that housing registered data is really quite fundamental to the process. But you do need to have the right data. You need to have the data that allows you to implement your allocations policy. If you want to prioritize based on whether somebody is in the armed forces, you need data about whether somebody's been in the armed forces. If you decide to add a new bit into your allocation policy that's going to prioritize somebody, then you need to make sure that you can capture and store the data to back that up. But you also need to make sure that the data is up to date. Is it accurate? Is it easy for people to update their data? So it's a case of you end up with large amounts of data that you need to keep up to date. It's not an easy task. Housing register application forms can vary dramatically in size. Over the years, the smallest one I've ever seen was 3 sides of A4 of questions, whereas the biggest one was 36 sides of A4. So it was nearly 500 questions that somebody had to answer to apply. That's a lot of data. In today's sort of GDPR world, you need to make sure you're actually capturing data that you need. So some of the key points that we always say to people that you should look for when you're creating a housing register application is try and make it as straightforward as possible. It must be mobile friendly. Based on the data that we see from site usage from our sites, you will have 70 to 80% of people applying on their phone. Now, when you look at application forms on phones, can be some really bad application forms, but you can also get some really good application forms. Try and make it so that somebody can actually complete it on a phone easily. Leads on to make the form intelligent. Only ask people questions that are relevant to their particular circumstance. If you've got children, why should you, if you've got people that are under 16, you don't want to be asking them questions about, are you employed? How much do you earn? The form needs to react and adapt depending on the person's circumstances. It makes it easier and much shorter for them to fill in. Automate the application process wherever possible. Make it slick, make it efficient, not only for the end user, but also for officers. It's possible nowadays, if somebody has little or no housing need, they're going to go into the lowest band. Do they need to be reviewed by an officer? Can you automate them and just make them active straight away? Another thing on from the automation side is if you're looking for the online submission of supporting documents, which is a key thing, the last thing you want particularly in today's world where not as many council offices are open. People don't have the ability to sort of send in post or drop off documents. Wherever possible, you want to be able to do the online submission of documents and proofs. Can you automate that so at the point that somebody applies, the system is saying immediately, can you please provide us proofs of identity, proofs of address, any other proofs that relate to questions they may have asked? These are all things that nowadays systems can sort of be intelligent and create these things and present to the user, oh, before we start looking at your application, we would like this piece of documentation from you, this piece and this piece. It then means that an officer is actually, when they actually start looking at those applications, they've got everything in front of them. They can do it in one go. They can do that assessment. They don't have to then keep writing out for extra information. Make it simple to submit change of circumstances. So if an applicant is submitted and applied online, then their route to submit a change of circumstance should be exactly the same. It should look the same. It should feel the same. You don't want them having to fill in a different type of form or go somewhere else to submit a change of circumstance. Make it very seamless. Make it easier for them to put that information in. And if it's information that isn't important to somebody's housing need, why does it need to be reviewed? If they're changing telephone numbers, email addresses, how many pets they have, there may be questions on your form that actually make no difference to their housing circumstance. So just save them straight away. Don't get somebody to review them. I suppose one of the other things that sort of comment that Neil made in one of his slides is don't necessarily deal with the housing register application in isolation. So quite often systems will deal with housing register applications separately from homeless applications. They may be joined by a person, but they're not necessarily done together. So one of the things that we've introduced is a concept of a case where you have different strands within the case. A housing register application is a strand, a homeless application is a strand. By grouping these things together, you're asking applicants for supporting documentation that may be used across more than one strand. So you've got an immediate view of everything that's going on with an applicant. And I think it's a really key thing to understand what is the bigger picture. What do they have going on, as well as just looking at the housing register and their allocation side of things. Have they had previous contact, and what was that contact? It's just some of the sort of key things that I think should be key to any housing register application and any system that you're looking to put in. From an eligibility and shortlisting point of view, it's all about getting the right people in the right place on a shortlist. So the system is great at rules. And as long as you have rules in your IT system that allows you to shortlist on whatever types of property you have, then you should be getting the correct shortlists. It's one of my bugbears that I speak to people and they say, oh, our shortlists aren't in the right order or we have the wrong people on them. For me, it's your system should say, when I run a shortlist, this is the right shortlist and these people are in the right place. So it's important to make sure you look at all of those property types you have. And every organization always has some strange property types that will have some strange rules attached to them. Build them in your system. As soon as you start having to fudge rules for properties to generate shortlists, it's very dangerous because it means that you're not following the process of everything else. You want to have rules in there as well that are flexible, that allow you to sort of change as new things crop up. So if you get new schemes, can you go from a minimum age 50 to a minimum age 55? Okay. Also, can we link to housing register data as these new rules come in? So it's important to make sure that your eligibility and shortlisting is as flexible as possible to manage not only what you have now, but anything that you may have coming through in the future. And be able to do that on a per void basis or per scheme, that you don't have to just say, this is the way that the system's set and I can't change anything else. Everything should be auditable. That's the big key thing as well. You want it to be an auditable process that you can then report back that you have followed your allocation policy properly, and you can actually show that it's been done properly. And the final thing is support for different allocation types. Whilst a lot of people run CBL, choice-based lettings, you may want to generate a shortlist in the back office. You may want to flip between the two. We're seeing more and more now that people don't just want to do one allocation route. They want flexibility to be able to generate a shortlist or advertise via CBL. Most systems should be able to do that now. It's a very similar process. So it's all about flexibility and configuration. As far as we're concerned, you want an IT system that will adapt, will grow, will change. And you can change going forward. As I mentioned with your form, you might not get it right first time, but it will allow you, if you've got the right IT system, you can then amend it and let it change as you go forward. We've recently been working with Dorset, and one of the things that they looked for was something that allowed them to evolve. And I think that's what modern IT systems should do now. It's not a implement, forget, that's the way we work. It's a case of allow it to change as you change and as you want more out of it. I know we were after some questions and we have overrun a little bit. So if I stop sharing, Vanessa, do you want to?
Yeah, so thank you both. I know that there was, I think someone that's just left the chat did ask something, but if we go to the guys that are still on, any questions from anyone?
Obviously, we can send out the copies of the presentation for those people that would like to see them or struggled on their phone.
Yeah, there was a couple. Oh, Patrick?
Thanks, Vanessa. It was a question really for Neil, and it was around the right to rent responsibility. And the work I'm doing at the moment is around our nomination agreements with various housing associations, and one of the things that came up was right to rent. Am I correct in saying that it's the local authority's responsibility to do the right to rent checks before nominating to a housing association or registered provider?
You would not be correct.
Okay.
It's a good, really good question, and it's somewhere where there's a huge amount of ambiguity. There's no decent guidance from anyone on this, but I can provide you something after the meeting. If you get in touch after the meeting, I can provide something in writing. But to tell you now, and for others' benefit, if an allocation is made by a local authority via a nomination to a housing association, then your test of eligibility that you would have completed through your scheme is satisfactory. There is no need to then do a right to rent check. So any allocation a housing association makes via a nomination, the eligibility test is sufficient. They only need to do right to rent checks on properties they allocate outside of any nomination agreement they hold with the local authority. Most housing associations don't know this, and many local authorities are confused by this position. But the test of eligibility effectively is a stronger test than the right to rent checks. So I say I can provide something in writing and sort of some signposts to where that is set out in legislation, because it is set out in legislation, but no need for you to get involved with right to rent checks or housing associations when you make a nomination.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you, Neil.
And just for clarity, no need for you to do right to rent checks on your own stock either.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Ashley?
I've got 3 questions. 2 are in relation to Hugh. So if I just go through those first of all. So we've got a system at the minute that is an interactive system. It tells the customer exactly what proofs they need to supply depending on what answers they give. We're quite happy with our system. However, there's some things that we want to consider potentially in a new system that our current system can't give. Around are proofs transferable between each case, so between like the homeless case and the housing application case, or is it that a staff member has to physically move them over themselves? And then also when you mentioned applications that might be in low, and obviously the system, does an officer really need to review them? I mean, what we're struggling with at the moment is that actually customers are very savvy and they know if they take a picture of a blank piece of paper or upload anything cover and select that document type, that it actually just ticks it off. So then we're getting applications come through and the proofs aren't all there, and then you're still having to go off and write out for all of them. So actually it doesn't cut the length of time down. So I'm just wondering if there's anything that your system has in place that maybe gets around that, or...
Yes. So when you talk about sharing the proofs, the way that we deal with it is we have an overarching case. So the case is like an umbrella.
Yeah,
and
like
under
a
that
customer
case,
profile.
and under that case, you can have a number of different strands. This can be housing register application, rough sleeper form, homeless application, risk assessment, health assessment, financial assessment. So you've got all these different things. Now, once that proof is uploaded at the case level, or if it's uploaded against an individual person, it stays with them throughout the life of the system. So if they then go off to another case, so somebody leaves one case and then goes and starts their own case or joins another case, then those proofs, if they're attached to them, go with them. So it's visible.
So, yeah, so, and that's what we've got. So we've got a customer profile, and off the customer profile comes all their homeless reduction act cases, any housing application cases, financial assessment forms, etc. So you might have a housing application case and the customer's uploaded all their proofs, and I'm thinking more about the proofs that don't have an expiry on them, so like proof of ID. So, the customer might be allocated and then the customer reapplies again in so many months, and then the system's asking them to obviously upload the documentation again. Obviously I'm assuming on your system, the proofs are uploaded under the application stage. So it is about the officer going to get the proofs from that and then manually upload them to the new.
Yeah, or we could say, well, actually, if you've got a proof that's within 12 months, don't bother asking again.
Yeah.
So the system can be intelligent to look at what.
So would it be intelligent enough to notice that former proofs were supplied within a period under an old application?
Yeah, could set that up so you're not asking. And when it comes to them uploading a proof, there's still a process in the back office that they need to be reviewed, that they're actually valid. It's not a picture of their cat, Mickey Mouse, their dog. And if it's not suitable, rather than write out to them, what you can do is you can just bounce it back to the person, to the portal, the public portal, add a comment and say, no, your picture of your cat is not any good as a proof of where you live. So by using that, it removes the need to write to applicants.
Yeah, when I say write, we do a letter and it's uploaded to the customer portal. So it's still on the customer portal, but it's just about, I mean, we get it a lot. 2 months bank statements. We ask for 2 4 months bank statements. You'd be amazed how many people supply 2 days from one month and 2 days from the other month. Upload and say, well, there's your 2 months. And they aren't. So it's just about whether
trying to make that as efficient.
yeah, and it's whether there's anything, you know, whether it's just that our system's not capable of it, or are there other systems out there that maybe could work a little bit better to help us with the volume that we're getting?
Yeah, we've tried to sort of streamline the data collection and proof collection as much as possible, and make it and break it down into sort of particular documents that you can ask applicants for, as opposed to just saying, please provide us proofs and give them a big long list. They can actually do individual. Oh, we need proofs for this because you answered this question in this way. We need proofs for this because you answered this question in this way. We need proofs for every household member that you've put on the application. So it tries to sort of make it a little bit more granular as to what you're asking somebody for.
Okay, thank you. And then my third question is in relation to the previous presentation and around allocated social housing and housing applications. So we've had recently some questions raised around capacity and what is actually a local authority's legal duty to carry out around mental capacity and assessments. And I just wondered if there's anything you're able to provide comment on around that.
Yeah, mental capacity, it's really a determination that someone lacks mental capacity can only be made by a relevant qualified professional. And it is unlikely that anyone in your service has the relevant qualifications to make that determination. So you would need to consult with a third party organisation, NHS Trust or social care professional or whatever, to get an independent opinion on an applicant's mental capacity and whether they had sufficient mental capacity or not, and then take their opinion and make your own decision as to whether or not that person could qualify to join your scheme.
Okay, so recently we've had some training carried out by a company called Edge, who said that it is kind of an up and coming theme due to some kind of challenges that have been made recently against local authorities, that actually a lot of housing local authorities specifically don't understand that mental capacity is obviously a very task specific thing. So, you know, you might have the capacity to carry out one thing, but not the capacity to carry out another thing. And what they're saying is housing, it is housing's responsibility, because they're the ones that understand housing, to carry out a mental capacity assessment, and that is actually a legal duty.
So that's an incorrect assessment of housing allocations law.
Okay.
The issue around mental capacity at the point of housing allocation is, does the individual have the mental capacity to take on the legal responsibilities of a tenancy? And if an individual does not have sufficient mental capacity to take on the legal responsibilities of being a tenant, then they can't join an allocation scheme. So does the individual understand that if they breach the terms of their tenancy, they would be evicted? If the individual has sufficient mental capacity to understand that many terms of tenancy would result in their eviction, then
sorry, Neil, can you just repeat that, because you just broke up slightly?
Sure.
Sorry,
So,
you were breaking up there.
That's fine. The issue is around whether the individual has sufficient mental capacity to take on the responsibilities of a tenancy, and whether effectively the council could seek through the public law system to evict someone because they'd breached the terms of their tenancy. You can hold someone legally culpable for something if they don't actually have sufficient mental capacity to understand an action or inaction they have or have not taken. So this has to come from a relevant qualified health or social care professional. You have to give them a set of questions around what their mental capacity, how it relates to their ability to be a tenant, and ask them to give you a position on whether, based on their professional assessment, they have sufficient mental capacity to take on the legal culpabilities of being a tenant, or whether they do not have sufficient mental capacity to take on those responsibilities. This is not something at all that a housing officer is qualified to make an assessment on. You have to reach the decision based on their independent advice, but you need to get some authoritative advice to help you make the decision.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Were there any other questions from anyone? No. Neil, I think that in the chat, I think that you went back to a few people, didn't you?
Yeah, in the chat, people are asking about where some of the data had come from, the stats. So I provided links in the chat for where that data comes from. If there's anything in my presentation, I'm sure it's the same for Kevin, but I've got lots of statistics in there, and I've got citing things from various green and white papers, and also talking about practice as well. If there's anything that individuals want to pursue after this session with me, then they're welcome to get in touch, and I'll either email stuff to you or have a chat to you like this, or whatever works for you. You're more than welcome to get in touch.
I think there was, Wendy, are there any examples of a good mobile friendly form? Don't know if that was already addressed or.
Yeah, I mean, most of the IT providers will have a good mobile form, but obviously, Kevin.
I would always say ours is a very good example of a mobile form.
Yeah.
And what I would do is I'll drop some screenshots into the presentation before it gets sent out to give some people some ideas of how a form can look nicely presented on a mobile device.
Yeah, super.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, if that is all from everyone, we can leave it there. Yeah, thank you both again, and thanks everyone for coming on this morning. I'll send across the presentation as soon as I can. If anyone's got any other questions, I know that Susanna will probably send something across. Obviously, I'll share it with you, Kevin, and you know, we'll you can obviously contact each other. But yeah, again, thank you so much, Kevin and Neil, if you want to stay on, and if you guys, the rest, want to have a lovely day. Take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. It's really good. Thank you very much.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.